What's up, y'all? Welcome back to The Build. As you probably know, the Datsun came with less than 200 horsepower from the factory. And because of that, when updating these to a newer engine, like I planned with my K-Swap, this thing needs to be updated. So whether you have more horsepower or just some of the old components are breaking down, this rear end needs some work. There's a lot of options and variations when it comes to updating the rear end on an old Datsun. About a year and a half ago, I decided to try out the Apex Engineered rear end kit. After several phone calls, it really seemed like they knew their stuff, and it allows you to run a 370Z differential, which can be a viscous limited slip diff, the 370Z hubs and wheel bearings, and 370Z axles. So those components make it sound like it'd be really strong. But as you can probably tell from the title of this video, my personal experience did not go smoothly. And as I'm filming this right now, about a year and a half after my first order with Apex, there are no Apex Engineered parts on this car. It's on jack stands again. But we'll get to that later. You can skip ahead to the end where I summarize all the issues that I had with the kit. But for now, let's do a quick recap of the install process for this rear end kit. First, I need to install these bushings into the subframe mounts. But once we put the diff in, it will probably have some interference right around here. And actually it seems like the diff is gonna fit really well because of this bevel here that's for the OEM diff, except our 370Z differential is gonna go over a little bit further this way. And it's important to note too that the differential will move while it's under load. And it's not pretty, but this is a little notch I made for the differential to give me a little more space. And for installing this differential into the Apex cradle, you're gonna have to order some special hardware for it. So these will be used instead of this wooden block. And then I ordered a spacer for the back side right here, and I'll probably use some washers as well to dial that in. I ordered a ton of different washers and these bolts here. Not crazy about how tight these tolerances are for the diff. And another concern is actually over here. So this is basically an interference. And if you have a car lift, you could probably assemble the whole rear suspension kit on the ground and then lower the car onto it. But obviously I do not have that. So I will be assembling it piece by piece. Heavier than it looks, I promise. And before you forget, the one with the larger diameter hole goes on top. This is the stock mounting point for the 280Z fuel pump. And as you can see, that is hitting the differential. We need to install the control arms now because once this is fully up and in the car, we won't be able to get this bolt into this hole. Then to get things to fit, they send you a crap ton of washers. Now with the control arm bolts in, we can fasten the cradle up to the car. And with those roughly tight, you can go ahead and tighten this back bolt to squeeze the bushing down. If you can get this control arm installed on your first try, then yeah, hats off to you. I had to do this several different times. One of them was to extend these out because once you assemble this bolt in, you cannot extend this rod end out. And I switched from the middle hole to the bottom hole since I'll be running with a taller ride height for the short term. I had to mess around with the washers quite a bit, and depending on what these rod lengths are set to, changes how many washers are on each side. I guess that gives you some adjustment for the suspension to move forward or backward. To remove this bolt, you have to support the whole diff with a jack like I have right here, and then undo this guy, and then you can take the bolt out and then adjust this length if you need to. If this bolt was the perfect length, then you could have the bolt head on this side, and that would allow you to remove it. And this has some resistance to it up and down. You have to get the washers exactly right on each side. And then when you go to tighten them down, it might change the resistance.
and be metal to metal contact. So then you gotta take everything apart, change the amount of washers, and try it all again. And it also helps to adjust the end links a little bit to pull them out or in. For example, the angle that seemed to be making it tight is this one is at this angle. So if you can lessen that by shortening this guy or lengthening this one, that will help with the binding as well. And I already had the bottom end of the coilover sent to Apex Engineered, so that way they could weld it onto their part.
Tilt it like this. All right.
And now we get to use more washers. The gap between the car and the strut is really small, so I don't know if that's gonna rub once there's some load on this thing, but I guess we're gonna have to find out. And that's why I had to extend out these rod ends quite a bit just for some basic fitment. Now really the only thing left to do is to tighten down these rod ends and get the wheels on. No. These bolts are scraping on the backside. So I might have to get the angle grinder out, cut some threads off of this, and then take some washers out on this side to squeeze this together. It looks like the tolerances are off for their assembly because on this side, these do not quite fit together because it interferes with their weld right here. But on the other side, I'm able to have 0 washers and have that straight up against the knuckle. After several iterations on both sides, finally got enough of the bolt grinded off and got the washers right.
At this point, the car was a roller, which was a great feeling after all of this time, but I encountered the next issue, the axles. You'll need to disassemble the OEM axles out of a 370Z. You're basically just replacing that center shaft with the Apex Engineered custom one. But I found out pretty quickly after waiting a year for these axles to come in, they were not machined correctly. And this is where I stopped. Now I'll recap all the issues I had just to let you guys know what I ran into. I realized that making aftermarket parts for old cars, it's a tough game. And this is only my personal experience. Some of these issues have been resolved already by Apex, and some of them are pretty minor. But let's run through them really quick in rough order of severity. First is the delays. I placed the order on July 7th, 2022. They did warn me when I ordered it that it was a pre-order because they were modifying the kit slightly for their new brake kit they were gonna release. But they told me it'd be done in 2 to 3 weeks. I received most, not all, of the parts 7 months after the initial order. Then I got some updated parts that still had some issues 1 year, 1 month after the initial order. I was always very courteous and understanding with them, as I know making aftermarket parts is very difficult. But every time I did call or get a hold of them, it was a constant promise of the parts will be ready by 2 weeks from now, or everything's gonna ship out on Friday. But that has lasted over a year now. As part of their solution, I bought their rear disc brake kit as well. And 2 months after ordering, I was calling them up trying to figure out what was going on. And it turns out they didn't have the license to sell the brake kit and they were testing some other options. So once again, I was in the loop of, we sold it to you, but we haven't really worked out the details yet. Next, unfortunately, they're rarely responsive over phone or email. The wheel fitment, they promised 16s would fit on their kit. In the original knuckles I got, 16 simply didn't fit and I had to modify the bolts. They did send me some revised knuckles, so maybe those would have fit, but I never got to try them out. The angle of the control arms when they're in the car causes binding once those bolts are tightened down if the washers aren't lined up just perfect. That caused some concern for me because under load or drag, I feel like that might cause the control arm to bind with those heim joints. For instance, the T3 arms are straight and they also don't have heim joints on the inboard side, so that'll prevent any binding from happening. If you're familiar with the Datsun rear end, you'll notice that the Apex kit relies exclusively on the drop studs and the front chassis mount. The OEM Datsun setup uses these drop mounts that hold up the control arm. So as a result, the Apex kit has less mounting points to the chassis, which maybe isn't an issue, but it was a little concerning. The kit was designed for the 370Z diff, and yet I had interference on 2 different spots when I installed the diff into the cradle. I had to use spacers to get the diff to fit in the cradle properly, which Apex didn't really mention anything about, and it looks a little sketchy. The initial knuckles that they sent had the strut very close to the car, so to get that to clear, I had to thread out those rod ends very far, probably further than they should be threaded out. The clamp for the front bushing on the cradle just pinches the bushing instead of going smoothly around it. Also, when you tighten the end bolt on it, the bushing isn't clamped symmetrically. I'm sure the bushing probably wasn't designed for this. The entire order I had, which included the front suspension parts as well, was all shipped in one giant heavy box. Because of that, no amount of foam or paper protected the parts. So a ton of the parts had nicks and gouges in the powder coating, which when you spend $4,000 or $5,000 on parts, you don't really want to see that. Then there's some more minor things, like the powder coating was very thick, but it flaked off in a lot of spots. And also the threads on a lot of the parts weren't taped up before powder coating, so you kind of had to clean up those threads before using it. This is a kit of washers. That gives you some adjustability with it, but I'd much rather prefer appropriately sized spacers. The hardware labeling was kind of a mess, just kind of piled up or taped on top of each other. To adjust certain parts of the rear end kit, you'll have to take apart several different things in order to get to those bolts. I had to cut some metal I didn't expect to on the car in order to get things to fit that weren't listed in the instructions. That includes the fuel pump bracket and also where the strap that holds the original diff down, where that mounts up. After 1.5 years of this, my patience was just gone. I decided to return all of the parts that Apex engineered. I personally just didn't feel confident with the parts on my car. It wasn't a fun decision to return the parts because I had sunk so much time and money on the kit, including those aftermarket parts like the diff and the axles that I won't be able to return. And getting a refund for the Apex parts was a whole nother headache of trying to get them to respond to emails or pick up the phone. I'm sure the guys at Apex are very well intentioned, and I know the aftermarket parts game is a very tough one. Again, this is one person's experience, and I'm sure with some design and iteration changes, things will improve. But just be careful. And if any of y'all have purchased some of their parts, let us know in the comments below what your experience has been. On a more positive note, I have a V2 version for the rear end that I'm really excited about. It'll be simpler, it's strong, and it's tried and tested by other people in the Datsun community. I'll be using the differential from an STI, using FutoFab axles and T3 control arms and the mustache bar. I'm really excited to get those parts installed in the car and get the Datsun back on the ground. So make sure to stay tuned. I'll catch y'all next time.